Hi, this is Farhan Zaidi. I'm a Major League Baseball executive, been in the game for 20 years, and you're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing.
Yeah. My name is Abhay Dandekar, and I share conversations with talented and interesting individuals linked to the global Indian and South Asian community. It's informal and informative, adding insights to our evolving cultural expressions, where each person can proudly say, "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." Hi everyone, on this episode of Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing, we share a conversation with Major League Baseball executive Farhan Zaidi. Stay tuned. As always, thank you for listening and watching and making Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing part of your day and part of your life. I know it takes time and effort, and so I appreciate everyone listening, subscribing, rating, and writing reviews, and sharing this with all your friends and family. You can listen at all the podcast outlets everywhere and watch the episodes on YouTube. This week, a slice of Americana is returning. Yes, my friends, pitchers and catchers are reporting back this week for the first workout dates of spring training, and that means baseball season is right around the corner. Now, some of you know, even though I'm an LA kid, I've been living in the Bay Area for nearly half of my life. It's created some tension in my circles as far as my sports loyalties, but the fabric of leading in sports in 2025 speaks to harmonizing so many Venn diagrams between old and new, data and instinct, loyalty and agnosticism, and many other balancing acts. So it was really terrific to catch up with baseball executive Farhan Zaidi for a chat about all of this. Now, Farhan's pathway to baseball was itself extraordinary. He was born in Canada and raised in Manila by his Pakistani origin family, went to MIT for college, and while completing his PhD at Berkeley in economics, was hired in the mid-2000s as an analyst by the then Oakland Athletics at the height of the Moneyball era, working closely with Billy Beane. He'd already excelled as a scholar in risk and decision-making, but bringing data and analysis to the people and performance platform known as Major League Baseball proved to be a natural fit for Farhan. He was promoted to assistant general manager in 2014 by the A's, then went over to my Dodgers to serve as general manager under Andrew Friedman for several years, before joining up in 2019 with the local team here in San Francisco as president of baseball operations. Farhan's success was evident from his early contributions to the Athletics being perennial contenders, to the Dodgers getting to 2 World Series in 2017 and 2018, to being named MLB Executive of the Year in 2021, of note the first and only South Asian origin person to win the award. We caught up recently as Farhan finished the season and his time here in San Francisco, and just ahead of his recent new appointment and celebrated return to the world champion Dodgers as a special advisor. We talked about everything from reconciling feedback and learned lessons to the culture of baseball executives and his own multicultural background in a very American sport, to even some thoughts about pitching and cultivating teams. But I started by asking him what it was like as an executive to be almost like this year's Juan Soto of free agents.
You know, as much as anything, I think it's strange because I have been fortunate enough to have worked for 20 years continuously in baseball, and whether it's the off season or the regular season, there's a certain rhythm to it that you become really attuned to. And, you know, I've certainly had more time for my family, more time to relax. That's been nice. I mean, it was a difficult end to my tenure with the Giants. And to be honest, I'm still a little brokenhearted about it because I love the organization. I love San Francisco, but that's kind of the way things go. I wouldn't put my free agency quite in the Juan Soto category. That's very flattering, but you know, it's been a silver lining is so many people have reached out, and it's really reassuring to know that you go through your career and you make a lot of friends and connections and people that be excited to work with you again. So that's been a really nice feeling.
I guess it does go back to, relationship development and what it means out there. And the fact that you're not necessarily tethered to an organization right now probably brings a lot of those relationships into focus and sort of keeps that at the center of all of this. And yes, maybe not quite Juan Soto-esque as you go forward, but hopefully close to that. As you do navigate transitions, and probably everybody does this at some point in their career journey, but when you've gone through transitions in the past, or even career leaps, jumping from whether it's college and grad school to Major League Baseball, how do you thoughtfully sort of curate the feedback, or even help do the autopsy, if you will, of the previous step and that previous role before moving forward in such a way that it sort of informs how successful or smooth the next transition will be. Is that something that you have to constantly be cognizant of, or does that actually require some very focused and intentional time to just say, hey, listen, I kind of need some time to really reflect, and therefore you can't necessarily go to the next step without that reflection?
Yeah, I've had a good almost 3 months now to sort of decompress, debrief, get feedback, do the sorts of things that you're talking about. Professional sports is such an interesting beast, if that's the right word for it, because there's process. Process is really important, and then there are outcomes. And I guess it's similar to a lot of businesses out there where you kind of need to be able to parse out the process from the outcomes and how much noise or luck factored into the equation, and really separate out what are real lessons that you can kind of take forward to the next job. And I certainly learned some lessons in my time with the Giants, and they're things that I would have done differently, the things that I'll do differently in the future, but also know that you have a sound foundation and there's a reason why you've had your successes in the past. So to have sort of a stable core of values and to really believe in your skill set is an important part of the process as well. So I think for me, it's being really candid about what happened, trying to learn
Mm.
some lessons, trying to feel a sense of accountability for what happened, but also having some optimism that I can kind of take those lessons forward.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that like there's so many different factors and stakeholders around people that it makes up for what the outcomes are, and then factoring signal from noise is always an important one. The steps that you had in your journey so far, are those previous steps and experiences that you've now had with different organizations and different people, and are they like sort of collectible trophies, or are they actual puzzle pieces that are still helping to fill in the whole picture? I mean, it's sort of like I liken it to the sort of connect the dots picture that's still kind of in play.
Yeah.
Or is it such that like, no, you know what? My time with the A's kind of trophy piece, time with the Giants trophy piece, time with the Dodgers trophy piece. I mean, how do you kind of maybe merge those two together?
Yeah. I think there are definitely lessons to carry over from each of those experiences, and your relationships and your experiences in those places really form the type of employee executive that you are. So, I think
Yeah.
about my 10 years with the A's. We were a pretty lean operation. We had to be really creative. We had to prioritize what was important and what wasn't because we just couldn't have the best of everything. Then moving to the Dodgers, that was a different environment where, I was coming from a smaller market team. Suddenly I was in a big market. It was a much bigger organization. I mean, the thing that really surprised me going from Oakland to LA was really just the scope of going from a smaller market team to a big market team, and just how much bigger it felt, how much,
I
how
feel
much
like
broader it
startup
was.
to major
Yeah,
major
and
sort of
honestly,
different
it really
organization.
was.
Yeah.
And then, coming to the Giants at, a time that was a down period for the organization and needing to build that back up. And one of the things that I candidly struggled with was sort of reconciling the recent past success of the Giants with, a little bit of the need to turn the page and, bring in new players and new blood into the organization. And so I think there are a lot of lessons from that too. So, I place great value in each of those experiences.
Yeah.
I think I've learned a lot from each one.
Yeah, I mean, they can certainly be trophies and puzzle pieces at the same time.
Right, right.
Um, I wonder, as someone who has to, in a way, bear the brunt of some of that burden, right?
Hmm.
Burden of past success, burden of sometimes being in a small market and really in a startup like environment, and even the burden of a legacy with, say, the Dodgers. I mean, all three spots are so different. As a front-facing executive, you're certainly often the first to get blamed and the last to get
Yeah,
congratulated in many experiences. So I'm just curious, for you, how have you, in a way, sort of prevented or staved off loneliness in this
yeah.
job?
That's a really good question, and it's really tough. I think one of the things that I learned coming with the Giants is how lonely. that sort of seed is when you're the key decision maker in the organization. When I was with Oakland, I had a very close relationship with Billy Bean and David Forrest. And, they're still two of my best friends on the planet to this day. When
Yeah.
I went to LA, I was the GM under Andrew Friedman. We were very close personally.
Yeah.
And I think when I think about my time with the Giants, I worked with a lot of great people and I'm really grateful for that. But I sort of, in some ways, understand better the role that I played for Andrew and for Billy because
Mm,
there were times with both of those guys where, I kind of wanted to be off on my own and
right.
they could be a little clingy, like, hey, where are you going? Let's hang out. Let's talk
That's
about
right.
it.
Right. Your
And you start
shadow.
thinking, I just want to go to my office and and look at some numbers and watch some video.
Yeah.
But I think those guys really recognize the power of camaraderie and the need for camaraderie when
Mm,
you're in kind of a key leadership position and just having people that we start off the conversation talking about my personality and I feel like, I mean, this is almost cliche, but you take the job seriously but you don't take yourself seriously, and
sure.
bringing that to the table in a highly competitive, highly stressful environment like professional sports is just really, really important.
Yeah, and I mean, that it can't be overstated, right? Being able to walk down the hall and share some ideas with somebody and know that there is comfort and solidarity with your colleagues that are out there, as opposed to sort of living out the professional leadership life on an island.
Right.
That can get certainly taxing. In that way, does it also make it tougher to be a true fan when there's almost a you almost have to be agnostic or even dispassionate about the work and the roles that you play that in a way to sort of take the fun out of it in some way.
Yeah, I don't think you can really be a fan of the sport that you're working in. I know that
Mm,
sounds really harsh, but
yeah.
everything you see is sort of through the lens of your professional obligation. And I think what you wind up seeing is you see a lot of executives, like a lot of baseball executives, or huge basketball fans, or football fans, or soccer fans, or
You
like,
find outlets.
yeah, you have to kind of take your passion elsewhere because
Yeah.
in your own sport, it's just work, and it doesn't mean you don't enjoy it. It doesn't mean that you're not passionate about it, but it's just kind of hard to be a fan. When
Yeah.
I have worked for, the three teams that I've worked for, I almost watched no other baseball. Like maybe I'd watch the
Mm,
playoffs when other teams were playing. Maybe I'd watch a team play if we were thinking about trading for someone on that team and I was sort of scouting.
yeah.
But just kind of watching a baseball game for the fun of it, like almost didn't do that ever. So
Yeah.
I think that's an example of what you're talking about.
You're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. After a quick break, we'll come back to our conversation with Major League Baseball executive Farhan Zaidi. Stay tuned. Conversation. It's the antidote to apathy and the catalyst for relationships. I'm Abhay Dandekar, and I share conversations with global Indians and South Asians so everyone can say, trust me, I know what I'm doing. New episodes weekly, wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Vivek Murthy. I'm the 21st Surgeon General of the United States, and you're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing.
Hey everyone, this is Arjun Amala, professional baseball player for the Toronto Blue Jays.
Hi, I'm Saurabh Netravalkar here, athlete from the USA Cricket National Team.
Hey there, I'm Parag Marathe, President of 49ers Enterprises and EVP of Football Operations, and you're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing.
You're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. Let's rejoin our conversation now with Farhan Zaidi. In that same spirit, because that's the sort of role and lifestyle of the modern professional baseball executive, it's a really different contrast from what the, I guess, age-old adage of old-time baseball guy, or like
Yeah.
somebody who's grown up as someone in Major League Baseball, particularly from the public face of someone who's, gone up through the minor leagues and been a player and a manager and then kind of lived in a front office role. Has baseball come to a point where it's apparent that the definition of the old school baseball guy has just changed.
Yeah.
And in that way, especially the longevity of the old school baseball guy sort of has to marry this relationship and integrate data and integrate market pressures and integrate ownership economics and all those things along with the sort of instincts and the day to day of what it's like to be an old school baseball guy.
Yeah, it's such an interesting term. I started with the A's back in 2005, which was kind of immediately after the quote unquote Moneyball seasons. It was
Yeah,
right after the Red Sox, using kind of Moneyball tactics and strategies, won the World Series in 2004. That was 20 years ago now. And
right,
so, sometimes I take a little bit of issue with the perception that, I might be a new school baseball guy or,
right.
something like that. I'm thinking, I've been doing this for 20 years. I mean, you look at the Giants and guys like Madison Bumgarner and Buster Posey and Brandon Crawford and Brandon, these guys were all in high school when I started working in baseball,
Right.
so
Who's calling old who, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
so and that's look, those. I'm not sort of saying anything about those guys, but just I've seen an entire generation of players go through high school, college, the minor leagues, the big leagues, and into retirement now.
yeah,
And look, there are people who've worked in baseball 30, 40, 50 years, so all the respect to them. But
yeah,
it's just interesting that this notion of new school has been around for two plus decades now.
yeah,
And at some point you would figure it's just kind of the way things are done. And in certain markets it is that way, and in other markets that maybe still have a more traditional slant, that you don't really get that feeling like this is just the way things have been done for decades in the sport now.
right, right. And I wonder if, in general, the pressures that you talk about, this integration, this like, yeah, it's so-called new school, and it's a lot of fodder for sports talk radio, but
Right.
in I imagine real life and the day-to-day operations, I wonder if it's sort of, it has to be the mandatory recipe for longevity because I imagine also that it's everything's a copycat business, right?
Right.
So in general, does relevancy and longevity kind of depend on how you can adapt to that blend of data, instincts, understanding the economics of things, relationship building, and cultivating that. I mean, it's all a big graphic equalizer, if you will, of how do you modulate all these things on a day to day basis.
No doubt. I mean, it is funny. I've sort of learned in my time in baseball. I think you get into the industry and you think that, being a GM is like running a fantasy baseball team.
Yeah,
Um, but I think what you learn is the sort of leadership and management challenges in baseball are very similar to leadership and management challenges in any sport. And,
yeah,
I guess maybe the one difference is baseball is very public. I mean, you've got a big audience that's paying attention to what you're doing. And I sort of think about, one of my lessons being kind of just marketing our strategy and philosophy a little bit better, despite the efforts that I made. I don't think we ever quite got there. I mean, it's interesting going back to that new school versus old school thing.
yeah,
I think there's this perception that being new school or data driven is kind of the height of arrogance in baseball, that you're a know-it-all. And I've never quite understood that perception, because the way I think about things, somebody asks me a question, what's a more arrogant way to answer it? By saying, well, my gut tells me X, so we're just going to do X. Or is it, or, the alternative being, let me look at the information, let me look at the data, let me think through it, and
yeah,
I'll give you an answer. To me, that speaks to a much more humble approach. But say, I don't know the answer. I'm not just gonna,
yeah.
say I'm going with my gut feel, but really that, I'm gonna be a little deliberate, thoughtful, look at the information, and then, I mean, that's really the way most businesses work.
Yeah,
Um,
and
but
yet
in baseball, it's different. Yeah.
it's a razor's choice of contrast, right? Like on the one
Right.
hand, one answer exudes confidence, and the
Right.
other answer exudes humility. And
Right.
one answer is like, well, listen, I've got years of experience, and the other is more of a transparent answer, right? So,
Right.
like in the end, are most of these questions that get asked either in the public eye or even behind closed doors, are they all just sort of the components of what you're constantly learning? do you have to sort of balance transparency and the ability to accept, that your philosophy constantly takes tweaking? Is that just something that you have to grow to accept? And by the way, it gets easier as you just get more experienced and seasoned in this job?
Yeah, I think like any job, like any profession, there's some learning by doing. I think when you first start, you have very specific ideas of what works and what doesn't, and you learn as much from your failures as your successes.
Sure.
I remember one anecdote from one of the things that I really appreciated about my time in Oakland is, Billy Bean threw me right into the fire. I was in his inner circle from day one. I was in the draft room. I was there at the trade deadline. I mean, I was in places I had no business being with no experience.
Yeah.
And he was very forgiving because I was kind of his guy and we got along well. And I think he knew that this was going to be a little bit of a process of development. Other
Sure.
people in the organization who I was imposed on probably didn't have that as charitable a view. I remember, I think back to the first time I was in the draft room in 2005, and I said some of the most absurd, ridiculous things. I mean, one of the areas that people have tried to advance in the draft and in terms of selecting players in the draft is understanding how much to have a statistical approach, what numbers really matter in the draft.
Sure.
And that's sort of still an ongoing process. But at the time, I just thought anybody who puts up good stats in college is going to be a good draft pick and do well in pro ball. And that is definitely not the case. But Eric Kubota, who was the scouting director with the A's at the time, I joke with him even now about how insufferable I must have been that first year.
Right.
He never disagrees with that. I mean, he might laugh it off, but he never says no. You were fine. So,
well,
I mean, I've learned a lot.
And do those messages, like if you were to take 2024 Farhan and try and send some faxes back to 2004 or 2005 Farhan, are there different ways that you would approach that, or is it such that like no, the thinking of that day and age was perhaps that much more forward that the rest of the crowd around you wasn't necessarily ready to think about that?
No, I actually think the lesson I've learned has less to do with advancing my own thoughts, backing off on some of them, recognizing that there was a lot of wisdom in the conventional way of thinking and doing things. And, maybe some of the value that I could bring was more incremental rather than scrap everything and start all over again.
Sure.
But building on some of the institutional knowledge that was already in place.
Yeah. No. And, so you mentioned that these are some of the learnings and the stepping stones. I want to ask you a slightly separate, or at least a thought question here. You're someone who your family is Pakistani in origin, and you were born in Canada, and you spent some formative years in Manila in the Philippines. How is this, journey perhaps contributed to your longevity or even the stickiness in a very, very American institution like Major League Baseball?
Right. Well, I mean, I would say, first of all, I've just been really fortunate to work with some people who viewed my background as a strength and not an impediment, as straightforward as that sounds. I mean, again, Billy Beans, not only did we become friends, but he became friends with my family, my parents. My mom would cook him Pakistani food every time she was here. We were in New York visiting them. So, that appreciation for somebody who's been exposed to multiple cultures, I really valued. I think for me, coming from those different cultures and having those different life experiences probably enabled me to connect a little bit better with people, especially people in baseball who are also from quote unquote unconventional or unusual backgrounds. And, baseball has a long way to go, but it's certainly becoming a more diverse industry. And, I really feel like I've been a champion of that diversity, not just because of my own story, but because it's something that's really important to me. So, there've been a lot of challenges along the way because baseball is a very conformist, homogenous culture, as a lot of professional sports are, but baseball probably more than any. And, it's always been something lurking in the background. I think, we talked about this idea of being old school or new school. When you have a background like I do, with family from Pakistan and, not being somebody who was born and bred in the US, you're always kind of going to be viewed as that new school guy, no matter how
Yeah.
long,
Yeah.
you've worked in the game. And, that's where I think kind of sometimes I view the term old school as a little bit of a dog whistle. It's,
Right.
well, people who've been here, people who've done that. So I actually don't like using that term because I think it has a lot of, subtler implications that,
Sure.
I'm just somebody who really believes that the sport belongs to anyone and everyone.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to put it. And on top of that, I mean, the idea that like that in background informing a lot of resiliency and the way that you can navigate and relate to people and really, make sure that the sport transcends labels in
Right.
that way. You're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. After a short break, we'll come back to our conversation with Major League Baseball executive Farhan Zaidi. Stay tuned. Every story told is a lesson learned, and every lesson learned is a story waiting to be told. I'm Abhay Dandekar, and I share conversations with global Indians and South Asians so everyone can say, "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." New episodes weekly, wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Krish Ashok, author of Masala Lab, The Science of Indian Cooking, and you're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tam France.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal.
Hi, my name is Richa Morjani.
Hi, I'm Lily Singh, and you're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing.
I'm Abhay Dandekar, and you're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. Let's rejoin our conversation now with Major League Baseball executive and special advisor to the Los Angeles Dodgers, Farhan Zaidi. You're also someone who's, whether with the organizations you've been with, the A's, the Dodgers, the Giants, you've had, from a just building relationship standpoint, you've had to hire and you've had to acquire and you've had to fire and you've had to manage contracts and negotiate new ones. From that vantage point, what if you had to perhaps unlearn about yourself personally in order to sort of succeed professionally?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think this really comes from, my South Asian background and upbringing, but I think in our culture we have a really strong notion of fairness and treating people the same way and treating people consistently. And I think sometimes, as bizarre as it sounds, that value has kind of been to my detriment because we might be looking at a certain player who we have to release and we say, well, look, the last three guys that we did this with, we released them with these kinds of terms. And so that's the fairest thing to do here.
Yeah.
But, if you go ahead and release those players under those terms, let's say they're not that favorable to the player, somebody writes an article about that release and they make it seem like you're the worst human being on the planet, So yeah. I don't know if that makes sense, but, my notion of consistency and fairness, it doesn't always mean everybody gets some kind of windfall. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but I think just treating people consistently and fairly is really important. And I think, sometimes I don't think it's it's a different cultural phenomenon, but
Sure.
I think because baseball is a very public sport and because of the way it's covered, a lot of times people make value judgments on specific incidents in isolation and don't look at the broader scope of how you treat people and how consistent you are.
Yeah. And is that something you've had to sort of unprogram about yourself, and that, hey, you know what, when I'm thinking about this as an executive and taking the total calculus in versus, how I operate or how I manage and think about relationships outside of the baseball world?
Yeah, I think there's an element of pragmatism to it. There's sometimes you have to let go of your notion of fairness to do what maybe is going to play best if you're looking at something that's a very high profile situation.
Sure.
And that doesn't sit well with me, but it's just the reality of the job when you're working in such a
Yeah.
public setting.
Let me ask you some purely baseball related, questions from
Sure.
both a talent standpoint and even thinking about the finances that are involved. Is starting pitching a bygone staple? And do you think 2025 is going to actually be the year, or maybe even the beginning of the era of the opener?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I still think a conventional, construction of a 5-man rotation is a great idea and it's an ideal, but there's a supply and demand issue in baseball, which is there aren't 150 starting pitchers that can make it wire to wire, that can make 30 to 34 starts. And so you're going to have to find a way to patch it together. Now, when I was with the A's back in the late, in that 2007 to 2012 era, we started toying more with unconventional pitching staff alignments and maybe having a tandem rotation where you have 8 pitchers and 2 guys, combined to make the quote unquote start every day and get you into the 7th inning or so. And, maybe you have 5 relievers to pitch at the end of games. But, I think, it's interesting in the Giants sphere. Again, it's a very traditional quote unquote old school fan base. And, they didn't like the notion of the opener. But I think the reality is to get through a season, you have to find ways to win games when you don't have a pitcher who can give you 6 or 7 innings, because that's just not going to happen in all 162 games. So
well, and not to mention the primary outcome and metric is always going to be wins and losses, but the other one is definitely longevity of your personnel and injury prevention, right? So,
right.
With so many pitching injuries that are just rampant throughout the major leagues, I wonder if that's that formula of having someone get you at least 5-6 innings per start, if not more. The days of people going complete games and that kind of stuff, it seemed like they're just over.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you think about that tandem approach where you have 2 guys who are each pitching 3 or 4 innings in a game, I actually think that is the best combination of ensuring the health of your pitchers and being effective from a competitive standpoint. Say you have a righty and a lefty, and then you can tandem. You get a lot of matchup advantages doing it that way. Major League Baseball doesn't like that idea. They want starting pitchers because they think, and they're probably right about this, that people come to games to see starting pitchers, to see a starting pitching matchup. So that's kind of the tension that exists in the game right now is, are we going to do what's right for players from a health standpoint? Are we going to let teams do what's right from a competitive standpoint? Are we going to impose this structure because we think this is what fans want?
Not to mention, the financial solvency of paying people for their value and their worth. Couple quick ones here. I mean, thinking of like the transparency of vision and philosophy, and the stakes of winning and winning now are so incredibly high. How do you balance that philosophy of surrounding stars with the right complementary players versus cultivating stars from sort of within a team that celebrates and really values the growth and the development of everybody collectively? I mean, it goes back to this idea of, does Major League Baseball and do fans and fan bases, do they just want stars and they want sort of secondary people around them, or do they like teams and do they like personnel growing together?
It's a really interesting question, and I think at the end of the day, people want winners, whatever that means. I remember when I first spoke to Giants ownership, my vision was, I want the Giants to be the San Antonio Spurs, the New England Patriots of Major League Baseball. And again, I think that's a cultural thing. It comes from my own background, which is sacrificing the individual for the sake of the team. If you can build that culturally in any organization, and especially in a professional sports organization, it's a really, really powerful thing. Now, when you're trying to cultivate that, sometimes it runs counter to this notion that fans want stars. They want, guys who they're really excited about. They want to buy the jerseys of those players. I mean, I think you can have a team approach where stars emerge. I think that's what you were referring to. But you're right. The way fans view, the offseason, they want to see their team sign, 1 or 2 stars. They don't really care about, they're not as interested in an approach like, this is a really effective way to build the roster, and I think this is going to lead to wins. Now, again, I think it just boils down to wins and losses.
Yeah.
You look at the Detroit Tigers, who are run by Scott Harris, who's the GM under me for a couple of years. They wound up using a lot of openers and unconventional pitching strategies in the last couple months of the season. They made the playoffs. You don't hear anybody saying, the Tigers need more 7-inning pitchers. They had an amazing last 2 months of the season. They made the playoffs, and people were really excited about it. So, I think maybe there's higher stakes when you're engaging in a strategy that can be viewed as unconventional. Like you need it to succeed, because if you don't, people will view that as the reason why you don't succeed. Whereas if you are, engaged in conventional strategies and you don't win, nobody's going to blame the strategy. It's going to say you weren't good enough.
Right. I mean, and yeah, exactly. Right. It's all on the field. And in the end, it's a good reminder that, pennants aren't won by fans on bar stools in March. So here's a couple of rapid fire ones. All right. So who is the smartest player you've ever been around?
That's a really good question. I would say from smart in terms of baseball, Chase Utley. It's not even close, actually.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
What's your favorite on-field baseball moment that you personally witnessed?
I would say, clinching the 2021 NL West division title with the Giants on the last day.
Not what I wanted to hear, by the way.
Yeah. Sorry, but that was pretty amazing.
Yeah, but I'll glad my Dodger gear is not with me right now. And then, what do you think about the golden at bat rule?
This is going to be a little bit of a long answer, but I'm for it if it's what fans want. I mean, I think one of the beauties of baseball is that you might have a superstar player, but he only gets to bat once out of every 9 times. You might have a superstar starting pitcher, but he can only pitch once every 5 days. I mean, in that sense, it's a true team game. But if we're moving to an era where people want to see their stars more, you've got to figure out ways to do it.
Yeah. And then last one, if you had to pick a single player right now to build a team around, who would it be?
I mean, I have to go with Ohtani just because of all the things that he can do. So
right.
Maybe that answer makes you a little happier.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'll say that. At least this year it did. I'll get you out of here on this. And I have always thought about phases and quantums that people leap into and out of in their careers. And as you think of this juncture, when you reflect on the past and now you're moving forward into the future, what are you hoping? And because again, you've been around this, profession and Major League Baseball for so long now, but what do you hope your legacy is going to be? What are you thinking about when it comes to lasting impressions on not only just the people you work with, but truthfully on fans and students and people who really love the game?
It's a really tough question, and it's a tough one to think about right now, with the way the season wound up. I would like to think about my legacy as, being in an era of baseball over the last 20 years where a lot of things changed and, where, I played a small part in it. And, I think a lot of things have changed for the better. I think the sport has really evolved in a lot of ways. I think the look of the sport, from a diversity standpoint, has evolved a lot. And it's been a really special time to be in baseball. And, I'm just grateful to have played some small part in that.
Well, Farhan, you've been cultivating some special moments for fans and for fans everywhere. And on top of that, serving as a real innovator and thought leader in Major League Baseball. Thank you so much for joining me today. This was really a treat, and I hope we can do it again down the road.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks so much, Farhan. Baseball season starts this year with the Dodgers playing the Cubs in Tokyo. A huge shout out to Nick and Brad and all the humans and canines over at Al's Barbershop in Alameda. Very gratefully, everyone leaves there a little smarter, a little happier, and with a little less hair. Till next time, I'm Abhay Darndekar.